Chapter 4. Arthur paid his $50 entrance fee and headed in. A lecture had just begun in a theater off the main hall as he arrived. The speaker was reviewing optional methods for collecting past due payments from grieving relatives in a sensitive yet firm manner, including the delicate subject of digging up delinquent corpses. Arthur took his seat. The main hall was a mammoth space overflowing with dark-suited men trudging about with fistfuls of brochures and briefcases. Each was pinned to a light green name tag, announcing oneself to the others. Most of the morticians' name tags identified the towns in which they bought dead bodies. Arthur wasn't certain how to fill his out. He settled on Arthur, freelancer. Half listening to the speaker's impassioned discussion of the proper storing of a repossessed corpse in an undisclosed location until final payment, Arthur sat, leafing through a few brochures he'd taken from a back table. The first had a plain cover with a simple message: "Are you properly planning your own death?" Another asked, "Death, what are the options?" An olive green brochure read simply, "So, you want to cremate your family." Lastly, for the environmentalists, there was a little brochure announcing a bold vision: "The socially responsible mortician, building a better world, one casket at a time." As best Arthur could make out, there was one common theme emerging: how to cash in on death. There seemed an eerie resemblance at some level between the dead human industry and the human waste industry. Thumbing through the conference program, Arthur found 2 or 3 lecture topics of particular interest. He circled a lecture later that afternoon on population control and the mortician's right to a free market, colliding interests, before stepping into an adjoining conference room to grab some Java and mingle. Arthur had maneuvered his way to a corner of the room where he was exchanging business cards with Edward Edwardson III. Fumbling with his jacket pocket, a pack of Marlboros fell out onto the floor, whereupon 6 or 7 morticians leaped past one another to hand Arthur their card. A grateful Arthur turned back to Edward Edwardson. Edward, by all appearances, was fairly typical of most of those attending the conference. His eyes revealed a caring, sensitive man, able to provide comfort, to feel another's pain, to help a mourning loved one find solace and peace. Arthur asked how long he'd been buying dead bodies, and he could sense Edward's mood take a turn. Edward, it seemed, was about to open up to Arthur. Edward explained that the popular characterization of morticians as buyers of dead bodies was not precisely accurate. Confused, and hoping to refocus the conversation, a flustered Arthur made a desperate attempt at mortuary humor. He noted that if old Eddie wasn't just burying dead ones, not to worry, his lips were sealed. Edward suddenly spotted an old friend across the room and politely excused himself. Arthur regathered and sought out further representatives of the death industry. Before he could narrow in on anyone in particular, a fellow mingler had spotted him and made his way over to Arthur. His name was Rick Astro. Rick was not a mortician. Rick was a male model who had been hired to help display a new line of environmentally responsible caskets. This explained why he seemed so overdressed. Arthur explained that he too was a mere civilian here among the gaggle of morticians, and that he had come in his efforts to discover the meaning and purpose of life. The two sat for a while by the cheese dip, watching others pass by and exchanging thoughts on the meaning and purpose of life. Rick's brief but eventful stint as a commercial corpse had given him some important insights with respect to life and death. Arthur listened intently. For Rick, attitude was everything. To truly be dead was a matter of proper motivation. As a case in point, Rick felt that the Zeus Flyer casket that he had modeled earlier in the day with its soft velvet interior and spongy cushioning provided just the right level of comfort for getting into character. Rick felt that being dead in and of itself was not enough. One needed the right conditions to fully appreciate and resolve oneself to the state of being dead. As he spoke, a small man in a silver blue suit rushed past, waving a clipboard. He called out to Rick, letting him know he had 5 minutes until he was due back in the showroom. To Rick, the death industry served a vital service of demonstrating to people that being dead meant more than simply not having a pulse. Certain basic accoutrements came with it. In fact, defined being dead. Without proper accessorizing, one truly was just a corpse. Done right, however, Rick was convinced that a simple corpse could become a fully dead human being. It was this basic insight, Rick surmised, that if applied to life more generally, could lead Arthur to his answers. The meaning and purpose of life wasn't just having a pulse. The meaning and purpose of life was having a pulse and knowing what to do with it. But Rick was out of time. For Rick Astro, it was time to die. Arthur came away from his meeting with Rick impressed. Now running late, he needed to rush to make the next lecture. On the way, however, he couldn't pass up the opportunity to stop by the showroom. There, fourth casket from the left, Rick's body lay in state. Passers-by noted the casket's durable design, its intricate detail, its shiny finish. Arthur saw only a brilliant performance. The speaker was beginning her lecture as Arthur hustled in. Arthur noted the speaker's extensive preparation and sensed that hers would be a sterling presentation on the elimination of obstacles to a free market in dead bodies. The speaker presented numerous charts and graphs. Her first chart broke down a yearly government budgets for family planning over the past 3 decades. Next, she detailed the number of dead bodies purchased in the country over the same period, beside the potential number of dead bodies had the government not pursued its anti-mortician policies. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. The speaker informed the stunned room of morticians that huge lobbying efforts were behind this drastic fall in market share. Powerful forces were organized and poised to cut back even more on the country's supply of dead bodies. The crowd grew surly, and there were calls for retribution. The speaker tried to temper the mortician's excitement. She explained that those forces aligned against them were quite varied. Some were more obvious than others, such as the consumer advocacy fanatics urging governments to force automakers to build safer cars and even forcing people, through big government regulation, to wear seat belts, costing morticians countless customers. A mortician toward the front threw a chair up onto the stage, yelling hysterically. The speaker was able to settle things down and move to another chart, which tracked the number of persons whose dead bodies could not be purchased due to specific government policies that improved auto safety. But it did not end there, the speaker implored. It wasn't the consumer advocacy fanatics. It was the militant, largely lesbian-organized, anti-family, anti-dead body free market, so-called pro-choice activists This movement alone was responsible for one of the largest drops in the number of marketable dead bodies to date. The speaker was careful to point out that there were two important aspects to consider. It was not simply this fringe group's efforts to legalize abortion, though this was certainly quite damaging to the market in dead bodies since it simply snuffed out the development of a potential dead body before it even had a chance to fully form. However, there was a yet more invidious, less publicized aspect of this powerful lobby's campaign. This was its efforts to enhance prenatal care. Their largely successful efforts to harness resources and focus government policy on the survival of malnourished, underweight infants had eliminated a vital market which had traditionally been used to supplement down periods of the year. The crowd was incensed. A row of morticians in the rear demanded names and addresses. The speaker was able to bring the riot-bent mob of morticians back down to an orderly rumble, with her announcement that there were, in fact, several noteworthy positive trends. They could still count on a good number of advocacy groups who championed a mortician's right to an unfettered market in dead bodies. The tobacco lobby, rebounding from hard times, was beginning to get back on its feet. This was a sensitive issue. There was still lingering hostility from segments of the mortician community over the tobacco industry's recent push into third world markets. Efforts to expand the tobacco market by addicting third world populations troubled many morticians who knew that they could not match the foreign competition. It was true that the industry had made considerable progress addicting younger and younger smokers in their home market, providing morticians with a later market boom. However, many still felt that if the tobacco was grown here, subsidized here, and manufactured here, then it was only right that the profit from the resulting dead bodies should remain here as well. Additionally, the strongest advocates of a free market in dead bodies, working through their exhaustive campaigns for the protection of yet-formed dead bodies, the self-styled pro-life movement, was still going strong. The speaker assured the uneasy crowd that the pro-life movement had made a careful study of the earlier civil rights movement and was masterfully employing the tactics and strategies of that era. Pro-life leaders had learned to isolate specific targets and maximize their impact. Thus, just as earlier good citizens had forcefully stood in schoolhouse doorways to block certain undesirables from entering, today, right-to-lifers block entry to medical facilities where the development of budding dead bodies is terminated. Just as earlier, a network of terror formed by simple common folk was required to thwart the efforts of the undesirables, the pro-life movement had embarked upon a sophisticated network of terror and intimidation, employing the tried-and-true tactics of the earlier era, including firebombings, physical assaults, and murder. Increased opportunities for tobacco addiction, along with advances in the movement to force women to give birth to fully formed prospective dead bodies, were important victories that morticians everywhere should take heart in, the speaker announced with glee as she came to a close. In conclusion, the speaker sought to reassure the crowd, reminding them that death, as Providence had so generously granted, was a constant. One must not despair at momentary market losses. What was important was to continuously help shape the dead body market of tomorrow by expanding lobbying efforts to combat those pushing to put limits on the market in dead bodies today. The crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause. The speaker strode from the podium, reminding one and all of their duty to remain ever vigilant in their resolve as morticians to maintain a free and open market in dead bodies, steeped in the proud traditions and principles for which we'd fought a revolution and 2 world wars. Arthur felt deeply moved. In his emotional state, he decided to unwind a bit at the cocktail bar With a heavy sigh, he leaned out over his gin and tonic, stirring it lifelessly. A dark-suited, quiet man ordered a whiskey sour, taking the stool beside him. The two exchanged glances. By his badge, Arthur knew his name was Todd. Arthur took a hard swallow, sat straight up, and turned to the quiet man. He asked if he was here for the conference. He was. He asked if he'd been a practicing mortician for long. He had. He asked if he'd found the conference enjoyable. He did. He asked if his plans were to attend all 3 days. They were. The quiet man drank his whiskey sour. Arthur drank his gin. The quiet man turned to Arthur. I know why you're here. Excuse me, a nervous but attentive Arthur responded. I can see it in your eyes, the quiet man said, stirring his drink and staring indifferently past Arthur's right shoulder. Is that so? Arthur answered, fingering the end of his tie. Tell me then, what is it you see? I've been to enough of these conferences to know just who and what you are. Really? Arthur looked at the quiet man, took another swallow, and leaned back coolly in his stool. Your kind is a common sight at these conferences. You want information. Arthur eyed the quiet man. I suppose you could say that. You won't find it here, the quiet man continued to stare past Arthur. What makes you so confident? You're looking for the meaning and purpose of life. Well, yeah, you might say that. There's always one or two of you each year. You think because we're morticians, because we deal with the ultimate ending every day, we have some kind of clue about things. So what are you telling me? Wrong crowd? You don't know? I'm not saying that. Of course we know. Arthur leaned in, lowering his voice. You mean the meaning of life? No. Then what are you saying? Arthur asked. I know who knows. Arthur took out a pen and notepad to take down the names, but the quiet man motioned him to put them away. He's long since dead, the quiet man confided. I see. He was a firefighter. I laid him to rest 10 years back this very week. He was 35, a family man. He'd been a firefighter nearly 15 years. One day, the station got a call. A house caught fire on Houston Street. A small boy was trapped on the 3rd floor, not 2 years old. By the time they arrived, the flames were too hot for the ladder to reach the 3rd-story window. The fire crew stood below helpless, horrified by the terror-stricken cries of the child burning alive in the inferno. His half-mad mother wailed and kicked and screamed, desperately wanting to rush back into the crumbling building. Jim knew his chances were slim, but the terrible, tortured cries were too much to hear. He pictured his own 2-year-old crying out his final, frantic calls for help, and he knew what he had to do. Jim grabbed an axe and dashed blindly into the burning structure. The firefighters trained their hoses on the frightful flames, and when the fire's embers at last died out, when the final charred remains smoldered into ash, there was heard a little boy's cry from within the blackened ruins. No one knows just how he reached that child, and no one ever will, because because there only feet from the frightened child, protected only by a fire suit and oxygen mask that saved his life, lay the burned remains of a firefighter named Jim. Arthur fell back in his bar stool. My God! You see, my friend, only a man like that, a man who would face those flames to save another's life, could tell you about the meaning and purpose of life. Arthur stared in silence. Pity that men like that lack the luxury of time to delve into deep philosophical conversation about the motive or meaning behind their selfless, life-saving act. Arthur slumped forward, emotionally comatose. Fortunately, however, in the case of Jim, he did leave behind a final note. You mean he managed to scribble his final thoughts while facing death on some miraculously surviving scrap of paper tucked within the child's protective fire suit? Don't be insane. It turned out Jim was a pathological gambler who'd lost his family's entire savings a few days earlier. Depressed and suicidal, he wrote out a note that he was no good to anyone. He'd failed his wife, his family, and himself. He wanted only to end it all. So the real tragedy of the whole episode, once the insurance company found the note, was they treated Jim's heroic rescue mission as a classic suicide by firefighting. So his wife and kids were out the family savings he had lost, along with any life insurance claims. The Firefighters Association took back all his awards and citations for bravery, and now used his story as a lesson for young recruits to avoid work when feeling depressed or dealing with personal troubles. Oh my God, that's horrible! Where's the justice? Where's the sense of it all? You see, that's how I reacted. But then something got me thinking. What was that? A sullen Arthur asked, ordering another gin and tonic. I was standing in the rear of the room during Jim's funeral service, counting heads and noticing that there were 6 more attendees than had been planned for, forcing us immediately to change to a buffet-style lunch, when I noticed the minister, seated behind the person giving the eulogy. He started to nod off, and that's when it struck me. What? What struck you? Arthur asked, as he motioned the bartender to refresh the quiet man's drink. Don't you see? The man's life had been such a total and complete failure that even God was bored. I've seen it before. It's not something morticians talk about in mixed company, but ministers falling asleep is actually quite common. Like God is channeling a message. A message, eh? What kind of message? I'm bored. God is bored? Precisely. Seen it too many times. Really? All I'm trying to say is, I think you're talking to the wrong people. The way I see it, if death is just a big bore to God, the answers must be somewhere else. I catch your meaning, but where? Where else can I turn? Just then, a voice called out from the shadows. Excuse my indiscretion. A tall stranger made his way out from behind the plastic ferns and approached the two. I couldn't help overhearing your conversations. And Arthur shot back defensively. And I think I might be of some assistance. The tall stranger had a wayward look about him. His stride was long and confident. His voice was deep and full. His hair was black and combed. If this tall stranger had something to offer, Arthur wanted to hear it. The quiet stranger hurriedly paid his tab and excused himself. Others, seated near the bar, retreated to more distant tables. A man at the jukebox stood studying the selections when suddenly the tall stranger halted in his tracks, raised his right arm, and, without turning his head, called out for the man to play 11C twice. The soulful sounds of Michael Bolton's slightly strained rendition of Whitney Houston's smash hit, I'm Every Woman, filled the bar as the tall stranger took the stool beside Arthur's. Have we met? Arthur asked. That's not important. You say you have some information, Arthur continued. I do. The tall stranger reached down, striking a match on his left boot, lighting a cigarette and offering one to Arthur. Arthur declined. The tall stranger lay his elbows on the bar and took a long, contemplative drag before turning back to Arthur. You say you want to know the meaning of life. That's right. And you think you can handle it? The stranger teased. Just don't waste my time, Arthur shot back, downing the last of his gin and tonic. Tall stranger looked Arthur over. All right, I'll keep it simple, the stranger answered. A long and dramatic pause followed. The tall stranger leaned back from the bar, turned squarely to face Arthur, and stared with a burning intensity into his eyes. Fine God, he offered. The tall stranger took a final puff, tossed his cigarette, and ambled for the door. The sea of morticians parted to let him pass. There's just one problem, Arthur called out. Oh, the tall stranger answered, pausing in the doorway without turning back. I have deeply conflicted religious views. In general, I see God as the imagined material manifestation of an alienated society suffering from mass psychosis in desperate search for unfulfilled truth and meaning in their lives. The tall stranger froze in his tracks. A hush fell over the bar. Raising an eyebrow, he turned slowly in his tracks, his gaze now fixed on Arthur. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way back over to Arthur's stool. All was silent, but for his steel-toed boots brushing across the bar-room's polished floor. He stood over Arthur. You saying you're a godless atheist? Well, your phrasing seems somewhat redundant, but yes, that captures the general flavor. Well, let me ask you this. Arthur sat with a smug, wry smile. Do you believe in the existence of automobiles? Certainly. And you believe in automobiles because somebody sells them to people who then drive them around, right? Something like that. And so one could say, because there are automobile salespeople, there are automobiles. Well, I suppose, well, it's no different with God. How so? There are ministers, people who sell God, as it were. Therefore, there is God. Well, I must say, I've never heard anyone put it quite that way before. I suppose you may have somewhat of a point. Certainly, the tall stranger answered. And with that, the tall stranger disappeared back into the shadows as the bar patrons made their way back to their seats. Arthur was beside himself. Here, at last, definitive proof for the existence of God. There could be only one thing to do. He had to immediately seek out the most commercially successful salesperson for God to dig up further answers. At that very hour, the Reverend Isaac Spindlestick was completing the taping of his latest infomercial, Reverend Spindlestick was easily among God's wealthiest salespersons. He had been marketing God and his products for nearly 22 years, and now could be seen nightly in 5 out of the top 6 media markets across the country. Arthur knew he had to find this paragon of righteous marketing and get some answers. The Reverend's press secretary said he could squeeze Arthur in the next day around 2:30 that afternoon. It would have to be quick, though. "It's a date," Arthur confirmed, and turned on his heel.